Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Quantum Spirituality on DreamVision7RadioNetwork.com, the show where past spiritual wisdom and present-day science merge to show us our future. Your host is Peter Canova, author of the 25-time award-winning book series, The First Souls Trilogy, available on Amazon, and Peter's website, petercanova.com. That's PeterCanova.com. This show is a live video, so if you're only listening and want to watch, go to Peter's website, petercanova.com. PeterCanova.com, where you can access his Facebook page to leave comments or questions. And click the D7RN link where you can receive a free gift video.
Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Canova, and this is Quantum Spirituality. Today, we actually have a show that's being done in the evening. I'd love to be able to call myself Dr. Quantum the Nightcrawler here because I've always wanted a cool nickname, but somehow I don't think that's going to stick. So we'll just get on to talking about the show itself. Quantum Spirituality, as I talked about in the first show, is about quantum physics and about ancient spiritual wisdom and about what they both have to say about the nature of consciousness. So the show really and truly is about consciousness. Consciousness is the most important thing in the world because basically without it, we wouldn't perceive anything in the world. We wouldn't think, we wouldn't feel. Really and truly, the world really wouldn't be there without consciousness. So to understand the nature of consciousness, honestly, is probably the most important thing that we can do in life, to get some mastery over our own consciousness and to understand the source of consciousness, where it comes from, and how it works. As I explained in the first show, this program is going to be a little bit different. What I really wanted to do was use the first couple of shows to give you some audio-visual presentations to ground you in the principles of consciousness as it was expressed by the ancient mystics and by quantum physicists. So the first show covered primarily the Gnostic texts. Gnostics were the ancient mystics that thrived in Alexandria, Egypt, and we spoke a little bit about consciousness from the point of view of these spiritual mystics. And tonight, we're going to be covering quantum physics, a topic that fascinates a lot of people, but that most people really don't understand too well. And so we're going to do an audio-visual presentation on this tonight. And that two-pronged approach from the first show, the mystical part of the first show, and the quantum physics that we'll talk about tonight is really going to be the platform for the other shows and guests and people that we'll be talking to that come on. But I thought it was very, very important that my audience kind of be on the same page with information that you can think about, that you can cogitate on, and hopefully take to heart to really get some mileage out of this show and not just kind of listen to me or anybody else as a talking head here. You know, there's no substitute for direct experience. And really, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to help people do is understand, at least intellectually, the principles of consciousness from different viewpoints so that you can go beyond an intellectual knowledge of understanding. And in your meditative practice and by other means, you can use these ideas to guide yourself to have an actual experience or presence of higher consciousness in your life. But I always really feel it's a two-prong approach. Having the framework of having the mental, intellectual understanding of how these things work, and then to incorporate it so if you own it, it's part of your life. You feel it. You really experience the presence of consciousness. It's a better way to go in depth to really understand the world around us and to really understand what reality is all about. So I want to tell you a little story because I think it's going to be kind of helpful and indicative of understanding the audiovisual part that we're going to see in a minute. And that story is about a neurosurgeon named Aben Alexander. Now, some of you may have heard of Dr. Alexander. He wrote a best-selling novel, I believe it was a New York Times bestseller, and it was called Proof of Heaven. And Dr. Alexander, like probably the majority of scientists, was pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool materialist, thought that consciousness comes from matter, and really just they call it an epiphenomenon of the brain. And all that really means is that the only source of consciousness is somehow your synapses firing electricity across one another, and that makes us conscious of things. And it's really honestly a poor explanation, as we're going to see. But this is really what Dr. Alexander believed. He denied anything to do with afterlife, other existences and other dimensions, near-death experiences, and so forth, until he had a near-death experience of his own. He developed meningitis, and it deeply affected his brain. In effect, his brain died, at least temporarily. He had no real brain functions, and this is what meningitis, serious cases of meningitis, can do. But the odd thing about it was that even though his brain activity was nil, he experienced one of the deepest phenomenon that anyone could ever experience. And he saw the light, literally he saw the light, and he conversed with a light being, and he gazed onto another world and another existence. Now, again, what's remarkable about this is that this deep and rich experience was happening in his consciousness, and yet his brain was really not registering any activity, really not registering any brain waves. And he did recover, fortunately. And the experience he had affected his life and completely turned him around 180 from being, a dyed-in-the-wool materialist to really believing that consciousness is the foundation of everything that exists. And the interesting observation that Dr. Alexander had was that the brain, which he once thought was the seat of consciousness, he now came to believe was the limiting factor of consciousness. And the fact that he was able to have such a vivid experience was because the brain, in effect, went to sleep because of his illness. Now, if you think about it in a way, this is a little bit analogous to what happens during meditation, because during meditation, deep meditation, our brain waves slow down. You've probably heard of the alpha, beta, delta, and theta brain waves. And the deeper you go into a meditative state, your brain functions, your brain waves slow down. And then people start really having these very enlightening experiences. So what that really tells us is that the brain is kind of a choke point or a limitation on consciousness. And you might say to yourself, well, that sounds kind of contradictory. Well, why is that? Well, we'll explain that momentarily in the audio visual presentation that's coming up. Another word that I'd like to say is that, there's that old song, Summertime and the Living is Easy. Well, right now it's summertime, but the living ain't easy anymore. Many of us are going through really, really tough times right now. And I happened to see a couple of commercials on TV today, and they were televangelists, people like the younger Billy Graham. And they were basically saying that, if you want to ease your pain and, no matter what is happening to you, all you have to do is accept Jesus into your life. And, essentially he will save you. The secularists in our society today, of which there are many, and even a good number of spiritually oriented people, kind of mock that whole thing. And, although I might disagree with the evangelist in the sense that by taking the figure of Jesus and saying turn everything over to him and all your problems will be solved. Essentially, you're looking for something outside yourself. You're setting up kind of an image or an icon and empowering it, and really looking at yourself as something separate from your source. You're looking at your source to save you, as if you were, something of a different substance in the source itself. And that separation, that fragmentation, I think has been a big part of the problem, as opposed to understanding that the Christ Spirit is a consciousness. And that consciousness is within all of us, even though it's dormant in most of us. Jesus probably read several chapters ahead, more than most of us did. But honestly, we have the sleeping Christ within all of us. We have that Christ consciousness within all of us. So instead of looking at a separate Savior, we should really look at how we cultivate that consciousness within ourselves. But let's not look down on people who describe themselves as Christians or evangelists, because they're seeking the same thing that we are. They're seeking to contact a higher power, and they have a different idea of how to get there than maybe some spiritual people do. But, we're all souls seeking our higher place, and we should never laugh at anybody else's journey, though we might disagree on the path that they're taking. We're all brothers and sisters in this journey. So let's, especially now, have a little compassion for one another. And at this point, we're going to take a quick break. And you're listening to Quantum Spirituality on Dream Vision 7 Radio. I'm Peter Canova, author of the 25-time winning First Souls trilogy, which is available on my website, petercanova.com. That's PETERCANOVA.com. So we'll be right back. Please don't go away.
The First Souls Trilogy, one of the most highly awarded fictional independent book series on the market, is a grand vision of human evolution. It chronicles the first spirit consciousness to enter the material world in 3 page-turning novels that introduce a new paradigm of reality based on genuine ancient wisdom and quantum science. These inspirational thrillers will force you to rethink the nature of the world in which we live. Visit the petercanova.com website for information and ordering.
Welcome back to Quantum Spirituality. I'm your host, Peter Canova, and this is Dream Vision 7 Radio. You can find out more about me at my website, petercanova.com. And please, if you have any questions or comments or things that you would like to talk about in the future, please visit my Facebook page, and you can leave comments there. It's Peter Canova Author on Facebook. And you can access that from my website or leave comments there. One thing I would like to do to help us as kind of a little segue into the audiovisual presentation, to understand from a metaphor what consciousness is about, just do a quick little exercise with me. If you can close your eyes, I always feel it helps to visualize when you close your eyes, but if you can close your eyes for a second and imagine a beautiful, clean, pure lake, mountain lake. It's in a valley high up in the mountains, and it is the most pristine, clear water you could ever find. And little streams of that lake flow downhill. They flow down the mountainside. And as they flow down the mountainside, they start to pick up some contaminants. They start to pick up some debris that carries down with them. And, the lower the stream goes, the kind of more murky and, you could maybe say polluted it gets, until it reaches the very bottom, where it really gets kind of downright muddy. Now, that water that's down the bottom, that muddy water down the bottom, is really from the same source as that pure stream way up in the mountains, but in its journey downward, it has picked up some limitations, and so the quality of the water down the bottom is not any longer as pure as the water that's up in the top of the lake. Now, if we understand, and you probably do at this point, that our higher consciousness is that pure lake, the higher spiritual planes, is that the purity of that lake. That as we have limited our consciousness coming down the journey down the mountain in order to experience what it's like below the mountains, down the flatlands, down in the bottom, down in effect in this earth that we call home here, in order to experience individualization, there was a limitation that occurred, similar to the limitation that Dr. Alexander talked about experienced through the brain when it starts to shut down. It's all about consciousness being limited. And that limitation of consciousness is really what creates the variety of life. That stream that goes down the mountain has different levels of clarity at different points. And that's what creates different dimensions of or vibrations of existence and so forth. So I want you to keep that image in mind a little bit as we go through the audio visual presentation, which I'm going to bring up now. And let's see if we have it here. I think we have it on screen here. Okay, so this is quantum consciousness. It's about the hidden reality that we experience. And it really is the story of how science and spirituality have come together to give us an idea and of what consciousness is all about. In effect, it's our life stories. It's how we emerge, the story of how we emerge as conscious beings. And last week we covered the spiritual side. Today we're going to cover the scientific side. But the reason why it's so important is that honestly, without consciousness, we can't think, feel, or even be aware of our environment. So let's really get down to basics. There's a lot of things that we get distracted about, but really consciousness is so fundamental that we all have to come to grips with it if we want to really understand something about life and how we can create better lives for ourselves. And that's what this is all about. Now, there are certain characteristics of consciousness. Consciousness is an intelligent energy, and it contains information. Consciousness or spirit is most certainly an energy, but it's an intelligent energy containing information. And what is information? Well, information is intentional direction. It embodies will, purpose, and guidance. It's kind of like a DNA or blueprint. It informs or directs the pattern of all things. Information is always about something. It's descriptive of something. And it's not only descriptive of something, but in essence, the information, the pattern of information is what makes up the object that it's describing. So we also have the fact that the source consciousness seeks expression by projecting or informing multiple viewpoints, seeing itself as through so many mirrors. And this gets back to what we talked about, how the mystics viewed the whole idea of consciousness, which was that there is a master consciousness that is the foundation of everything that exists, the foundation of all creation. But that master consciousness wanted to express itself through other dimensions of existence. It didn't want to sit there in effect as just static and motionless and being everything. It wanted to be also a something. And the way it became a something was by a limitation of consciousness into multiple viewpoints, which would include you and me and other levels of being that we would not detect with our physical senses. But these multiple viewpoints became almost like mirrors, so that the master consciousness contemplates itself and it sees itself as through so many individual mirrors. In effect, it's a way for the source consciousness to know itself through having something other than itself to reflect upon or reflect through. So the multiple viewpoints are differentiated from the source and from each other by degrees of limitation of information or limitation of awareness. And we covered this a couple minutes ago, but in order for the everything to become a something, it had to, in a sense, limit its consciousness in order to make it distinct. Otherwise, it could never be distinct from the source. If it would always be part of the infinite, always be part of the everything. And to have a sense of being finite, to have a sense of being individual, it could only happen through varying degrees of limiting consciousness. So consciousness also uses degrees of matter as vehicles to express itself within these multiple viewpoints. And this gets back to an important thing that we discussed last week, which is matter is extremely critical here. A lot of spiritual people tend to look down on matter, something kind of nasty, and it's kind of these low life things that we kind of have to experience. But honestly, another way that consciousness differentiates itself is that pure spirit seems to want to bind itself to different degrees of matter. And when I say degrees of matter, don't think of matter simply as the gross physical matter that we experience in this world. There are very fine degrees of matter that we don't see, as we're going to discuss. And these different degrees of matter can exist in different dimensions and different degrees of vibration, higher or lower vibration, but they're still matter as opposed to pure energy or spirit. So matter seems to be one of the ways, or a primary way, that consciousness uses as a vehicle to distinguish itself within these multiple viewpoints. So matter is kind of, you can say in some ways, the flip side of spirit seeking experience. Now, since all various forms derive from one source, they are interconnected and they can communicate between one another. And this is the point that I was making a little earlier about not empowering sort of a kind of a separate icon to put our faith and our hopes in, but understanding that our faith and hope lies within ourselves, because the one master consciousness that essentially creates everything is really the power inside ourselves. And our job really is to try and overcome the limitations that we have in order that we can communicate with that higher source of consciousness, and really can communicate between one another, because in truth, really, we are all linked together. And finally, human beings are higher consciousness in the densest, lowest frequency form of matter, but we are capable of transcending. People, not just the great sages in life, but there are other people who, with varying degrees, have really achieved remarkable illumination in their lives by tracing the source of their own consciousness. It takes a little effort, it takes a little work, but all of us are capable of doing it, because that consciousness lies dormant within us. It is us, and it lies dormant within us. We just really have to recognize it. It's like a radio broadcast that runs 24/7. We just have to tune into the right station, so we're not getting the static, but we're getting the clear communication. So just to review quickly the spiritual view of creation by limitation, there was a funneling down effect of consciousness. It started with the supreme consciousness, and that projected a lower level of higher spirit consciousness. This is the level of archetypes, which we'll discuss soon. And then from that, it proceeded down to the psychic or soul level of consciousness. And then in turn, finally into physical or material consciousness. So consciousness went through, or morphed through, these various stages of limitation to have different types of experience: spiritual experience, psychic, soul or mind experience, and then experience in a material physical body. But these are all expressions of the same intelligent light energy. And that was the source of, or the belief of, the Gnostics and most of the ancient mystery teachings of several thousand years ago. So let's look at now the Judeo-Christian religious idea of creation. And this was kind of, well, many of you know this story. I mean, basically, there's kind of a God out there, and he waved his hand and created this human being out of the dust of the earth. And then we did something to tick God off, and now we're forever trying to get back into God's good graces. But the idea here is that there was a separation, really. The human being was not a projection of the one consciousness. It was a creation. There's a difference between projecting its essence out, but being part of that same essence, as opposed to creating something kind of like a little separate wind-up doll in this lunatic asylum that we call Earth down here. So the scientific materialist view of creation was that inorganic matter, we started with inorganic matter, and somehow that developed a little bit of life as a single cell organism, which combined to a multicellular organism, and then evolved up to a primitive form of sentience, and then finally to self-aware sentience or human consciousness. The problem with this is, number one, nobody has been able to prove and figure out how inorganic matter all of a sudden became life. They tried several different things. There was the whole, what do they call it? The primordial soup hit by lightning, and, so forth, all been debunked. And there really is no explanation that makes the scientific materialist view of creation, which is that matter started everything and consciousness was a derivative of matter. Nothing has really shown that there's any merit or really even any logic to that scientific materialist argument. So essentially, we have religion, which is consciousness from nothing, and it limits free will because we were bound by divine law. And then you have science, which is consciousness by accident, and it limits free will, bound by natural law. Both of them led to ideas of separation, which we'll discuss when we come back. We're now going to take another break. This is Peter Canova, Quantum Spirituality on Dream Vision 7 Radio. Please visit my website, petercanova.com, and we'll be back in a minute.
The First Souls Trilogy, one of the most highly awarded fictional independent book series on the market, is a grand vision of human evolution. It chronicles the first spirit consciousness to enter the material world in 3 page-turning novels that introduce a new paradigm of reality based on genuine ancient wisdom and quantum science. These inspirational thrillers will force you to rethink the nature of the world in which we live. Visit the petercanova.com website for information and ordering. In a world facing annihilation, a miraculous African nun rises to become the first female pope through a web of war, murder, and betrayal. Loved by some, hated by many, she becomes the deadly target of Islamic terrorists and her own cardinals as she introduces a new vision that will either save humanity or accelerate its destruction. 4 people must race against a nuclear holocaust to learn her astonishing secret. Pope Annalisa is available at petercanova.com, Amazon, and other online booksellers and bookstores worldwide.
Omega Institute, offering workshops, retreats, and online learning dedicated to awakening the best in the human spirit. For over 40 years, Omega has seen more than 1 million people come through its doors to grow, learn, and find a greater sense of purpose. With over 350 workshops to choose from, Omega offers something for everyone. Located in Rhinebeck, New York, just 90 miles north of New York City, Omega's natural environment and quiet pace allow for extraordinary experiences to unfold. Learn more at eomega.org or call 877-944-2002. Again, 877-944-2002.
How did life start on Earth, and why is there so much suffering? Are we living in a simulated reality like the characters in the Matrix movie? Do parallel dimensions exist alongside ours, influencing our experience? What are the mysterious dark energies that penetrate our universe? Peter Canova folds space and time to bring the twin bookends of ancient wisdom and quantum science into a single focal point, answering these and many other deep mysteries of the creation. Quantum Spirituality can be heard every Tuesday at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Eastern and 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Pacific on syndicated Dream Vision 7 radio network. See the show where past and present merge to show us our future.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
Welcome back. I'm Peter Canova. This is Quantum Spirituality on Dream Vision 7 Radio. We, before the break, had discussed the picture of spiritual creation, religious creation, and scientific materialist creation. And as we discussed here, the one thing that both materialist science and religion, which really have been at each other's throats, have in common is that they both separate human beings from the creative source. Their viewpoints both separate human beings from the creative source. And this has led to real fragmentation in our whole worldview. You have the creator and the created. That's the religious point of view. And in science, you have the observer and the observed. In other words, the scientist traditionally, the traditional scientist feels that somehow a human stands outside of the world that they're in, observing it. And that's really created a lot of problems in scientific experiments that they've run up against. The point of view that the thing that we're observing is different from us, the observer, doesn't hold water, and we'll see why that is. So we have the visible world. There's been a real dichotomy here, I should say, even in traditional physics. And the dichotomy is that the visible world really seems to have nothing in common, almost seems to be opposed to the quantum world, which makes it up. In other words, science recognizes that everything around us arises from the quantum world. But the problem is when you examine the visible world and the quantum world, they just don't add up. They don't make any sense. So here's some examples. For instance, in the visible world, we believe, or we see, in solid matter and particles. In the quantum world, particles are not fundamental. What's fundamental is waves of light energy, not solid matter or particles. And the visible world seems to have a smooth, continuous appearance to us. In the quantum world, things are more like a continuous unfolding, like separate snapshots strung together. In fact, the whole word quantum was coined by physicist Max Planck, who realized that light is emitted in little packets, not continually, but in little packets of energy, be called quanta. Although that kind of, and think of a flip book, animation, where you have a bunch of separate little images and you kind of flip them and they all seem to move and they seem to be smooth, but in reality, they're all a bunch of separate images. So, we have this smooth appearance in the visible world, but this kind of choppy thing in the quantum world. And then you have the fact that in the visible world, you can really only have one object occupying the same space at any given time. That does not hold true in the quantum world. You can have a number of objects existing in the same space. So how does that make sense? In the visible world, time is linear. In the quantum world, time is pretty much non-existent. It's not linear. The visible world, we have a limitation on the speed of light. But in the quantum world, there is no speed of light limitation. We see instances where things happen that seem to exceed the speed of light. And then there's a little thing here called locality and non-locality. Now, locality means, like in the visible world, anything that happens seems to be confined to the point where it happened. where in the quantum world, things can happen simultaneously. In other words, what can be experienced in one location that's the equivalent of light years away can be experienced instantaneously. The same thing can be experienced in another location. So as you can see, there's these paradoxes in between the visible and the quantum world, which science, materialist science, has really struggled to explain. So where's the connection here? What binds these things together? Well, now we're going to discuss about how the whole idea of consciousness started to creep into scientific materialism, how it's starting to overturn the traditional materialist view that matter came first and consciousness somehow is just a byproduct of matter that probably would not survive the demise of matter because all matter eventually disintegrates. And if you look at the very foundations of early quantum physics at the beginning of the 19th century, you have two branches of quantum physics. Relativistic physics, which is the physics of the very large scale objects, planetary scale, things that we see. And then you have quantum physics, which is Max Planck on the right, incidentally, and Albert Einstein on the left there. The father of quantum physics was Max Planck. And this is the physics of the microscopic world, the macroscopic versus the microscopic world. You start to see cracks, though, in the whole materialist interpretation, even early on here, where Einstein says mass and energy, and this is from his famous E equals mc squared, mass and energy are but different manifestations of the same thing. A human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. Again, you see the idea here of limitation. And Max Planck goes even further and says, behind the existence of all matter is a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Now, please note here that this is the founder of quantum physics telling us this, indicating about consciousness being fundamental. And this was very early on. So you really have now you see them coming around more to what the mystic tradition was saying, which is God is consciousness and light, which is fundamental, and light energy limited itself to create matter. So both branches of physics are starting to own up very early on to the fact that, well, you know what, there may be something to this whole mystical conception of consciousness and how life and creation started here. So remember, we mentioned quantum non-locality. Now, this is a really strange phenomenon. Einstein called this spooky at a distance. And if you see two electrons here, okay? So the electron on the right takes an arrow to the head, and then the electron which is the equivalent of, I don't know, if we use a planetary scale, you know, hundreds of light years away, hundreds of light years distant, says ouch at the same time. In other words, it experiences what the first electron was experiencing instantaneously, faster than the speed of light. How does that happen? What could be the explanation for that? And this is one of the things that started to, cause the materialist interpretation of things to be questioned. And you have another little thing that came along here, the famous double slit experiment here. And to make a long story short, we could really get involved with this one, but to make a long story short, scientists would fire electrons through two slits in a screen, and they would form basically a wave pattern, as you can see over here, the way they hit the back of the screen. And that was when they were unobserved by humans. This was just a random firing, and nobody really set up any observation of how it happened. But this is kind of counterintuitive, right? Because there's only two slits there. So how do you see this wavy series of light patterns on the other side from these electrons? It doesn't seem correct. Then when you start to observe the experiment, when the physicists started to set up equipment and actually directly observe the phenomena, all of a sudden the behavior of the electrons changed. The same electrons were fired through the same double slit, and yet they appeared the way that you would expect them to appear, which is two lines instead of the series of waves. So what actually occurred is, as soon as these electrons were observed, and instead of acting like waves like they did unobserved, they collapsed into particles and made a particle pattern there. So what this really said was that the consciousness of the observers altered the behavior of the electrons. It essentially collapsed the wave. This is what you call collapsing the quantum wave, collapsed the wave function into particle form, and the electrons appear as particles with these two lines on the screen on the right. How does that happen? Well, it gets a little bit more mysterious here. There was another experiment done by a Russian named Vladimir Popinin, where he had a vacuum tube that was filled with photons of light. Photons basically are the particles that carry light, and the photons were just kind of randomly bouncing around the vacuum tube there. Well, they inserted human DNA into the vacuum tube, and lo and behold, what happened? The photons began to cluster around the DNA helix, forming a helix pattern around the DNA. They reacted to the DNA as if the DNA was informing them. We get back to this information again as a blueprint, and causing the electrons to form around the helix pattern. And when they took the DNA out, the helix pattern stayed. So human DNA was actually able to communicate with these photons and organize them from a random to an organized pattern. So what we're seeing here is that some kind of communication was happening even down at a cellular and a quantum level. Again, you have to ask yourself, well, how is that happening? And these are the kind of experiments that started to make people question the whole materialist theory that matter was just kind of matter, and lower forms of matter have no consciousness in them, and the fact that we evolved into a higher form that was able to think was just kind of an accident of a more organized form of matter. It just wasn't really holding up. So now we're going to talk about quantum consciousness and the quantum history of our hidden reality.
Microscopic world, general relativity, or relativity theory in general, is about explaining the largest cosmic dimensions, space-time, gravity, the whole macroscopic order of the cosmos. The two theories describing these two realms really can't do that. They have not been compatible with each other since their inception.
With that absolute contradiction of the two basic theories, I said there was only to try to find out what they had in common. Now, what they have in common is what I call undivided wholeness.
So too was Bohm starting to intuit that we needed a fundamentally new way to describe the connection between the macro and the micro.
My feeling is that gave an insight to Bohm that this world we live in, it's all hard and fast. The expected order, this is the expected order, is really just a surface order. It's not a deep, profound order. And there's something lies underneath it, which he called the implicate order. So the expected order comes out of the implicate.
David Bohm was suggesting that everything is internally related to everything else, and that each part of the cosmos contains the whole universe and unfolds into our perception of reality.
University of London physicist named David Bohm, who's a former protege of Einstein, and a Stanford University neurophysiologist named Carl Pribram. And they worked independently. Pribram was studying memory and found that there's evidence that the brain operates holographically. And Bohm was studying subatomic physics and found that on the subatomic level, the fabric of reality seems to possess properties that are reminiscent of a hologram. So if we put those two ideas together, that our brain seems to be holographic and the universe is holographic, it suggests that maybe there's compelling evidence that the universe may be a kind of hologram, but that it's a good metaphor, a way of understanding the universe.
Now, when you say it's holographic, what do we mean, really?
That, in a nutshell, that reality may be more plastic and changeable, like an image, than a solid construct, a sort of sticks and stones world.
So those audio clips were about or from different physicists. And you can see that the thinking there was, wow, we have this contradiction between the macroscopic world and the microscopic world, and how do we bridge this? And when we come back, we're going to discuss how some of those answers evolved. I'm Peter Canova. with Dream Vision 7 Radio and Quantum Spirituality. We're going to take a short break now. Please visit my website, petercanova.com, where you can find out a lot more information, not only about me, but about the subject we're talking about tonight. We'll be back in a minute.
The First Souls Trilogy, one of the most highly awarded fictional independent book series on the market, is a grand vision of human evolution. It chronicles the first spirit consciousness to enter the material world in 3 page-turning novels that introduce a new paradigm of reality based on genuine ancient wisdom and quantum science. These inspirational thrillers will force you to rethink the nature of the world in which we live. Visit the petercanova.com website for information and ordering. In a world facing annihilation, a miraculous African nun rises to become the first female pope through a web of war, murder, and betrayal. Loved by some, hated by many, she becomes the deadly target of Islamic terrorists and her own cardinals as she introduces a new vision that will either save humanity or accelerate its destruction. 4 people must race against a nuclear holocaust to learn her astonishing secret. Pope Annalisa is available at petercanova.com, Amazon, and other online booksellers and bookstores worldwide.
What if dreams can diagnose your life? What if we can meet the love of our life in dreams? Join host Kat O'Keefe Canavas, the #1 internationally best-selling author of Dreams That Can Save Your Life, written with Duke University medical doctor Larry Burke. Dreaming Healing is where we'll explore dreams, research, and interpret dreams from you, the caller. Dreaming Healing shows can be heard every Tuesday at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern, with live shows on the first and third evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific Time on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. Come live your dreams out loud with Kat.
How did life start on Earth, and why is there so much suffering? Are we living in a simulated reality like the characters in the Matrix movie? Do parallel dimensions exist alongside ours, influencing our experience? What are the mysterious dark energies that penetrate our universe? Peter Canova folds space and time to bring the twin bookends of ancient wisdom and quantum science into a single focal point, answering these and many other deep mysteries of the creation. Quantum Spirituality can be heard every Tuesday at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Eastern and 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Pacific on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. See the show where past and present merge to show us our future.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
The audio clips you just heard were from different physicists, and you can see that they're now starting to think, wow, how can we bridge this inexplicable gap between what we see in the macro world, but what actually is happening in the micro world that the macro world comes from. And we're coming to the end of our show tonight, so we're going to pick this up on next week's show, and we're going to start to get into exactly how materialist science is coming around to the idea of consciousness being the fundamental factor that creates the universe. I want to thank our producer, Bob, and please join me again next Tuesday or the first Tuesday of each month. This show will be archived on my Dream Vision 7 page, which is accessible from my website, which is petercanova.com. That's petercanova.com. And until next time, please remember to stay conscious, to stay quantum, and to stay spiritual. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
This ends today's segment of Quantum Spirituality, the show where the past and present merge to show us our future. Join us the first Tuesday of each month for cutting-edge information and informative new episodes. This show will be archived on the Quantum Spirituality Dream Vision 7 Radio Network website page, also accessible at petercanova.com. That's petercanova.com.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.